France as well. So welcome. We're going to talk about the hybridization of wind farms and PV parks. The term hybridization covers several realities, which we're going to talk to you about shortly. So what are the advantages of hybridization? And I'm going to show you the map, or the schedule for this round table. So we'll talk about advantages and constraints, notably related to the grid. One of the examples of questions is how can installed capacity be added when the sum of wind and solar power exceeds the authorized or available connection capacity? Is it worthwhile to restrict an installation in order to cap production? What are the possible solutions? So we're going to talk about this for the next hour. And 4 people are here to answer these questions because they're specialists in this area. My name is Carol Rapp. I'm a journalist who's specialized in the energy transition, and I'm happy to welcome to this roundtable Aline Chapoulliot, head of innovative offers at ENGIE Green, which is a subsidiary of the ENGIE Group, which develops and produces wind and solar energy in France. We have Elodie Saya, head of legal and institutional affairs at the Renewable Energy Union, the SER. Etienne THOMASSIN, hello, who's the CEO and CEO of EDP Renouvelables, which is a subsidiary of the Portuguese energy group EDP. And then finally, Gaël, the director of development at TOTALENERGIES, who also produces renewable energies in France, among other things. There will be 2 Q&A sessions, one in 20 minutes and another at the end, so in less than an hour. And again, as I said in the beginning, for those who weren't here, you need to scan the QR code on the screen above. You can zoom in. It works even from the back of the room. That allows you to open the Slido application without downloading it. And then you can ask your questions in a written form, and we'll answer them in the 2 separate phases or at 2 separate moments. So let's begin by going around the table on hybridization. What does hybridization mean? What's the definition? What are the upcoming projects? I'll start with Aline Chapoulliot of ENGIE Green. How would you define hybridization, and why has hybridization been attracting interest today? Hybridization is a definition which is rather simple. For us, it is joining together wind turbine production and PV park in one area, one location. So it's rather simple to say. On paper, it's simple, but we'll see that in the reality, it's a little more complicated. The interest of hybridization is rather recent at ENGIE Green. There are 4 things that we've recognized. The first, when we develop these projects, we have limited tension points. In France, we have a lot of wind turbines, 15,000 currently operating. At ENGIE Green, we have 1,200 with all of their batteries and all of the existing cables and existing wind turbines. So we've got these parks that exist, and we want to take advantage of them collectively. The third element is that in a very general way, in France, when there's wind, there's no sun, and it's the same thing. You'll say in Occitanie it's not the same. It's certainly true that in Occitanie we have the 2 resources, but in France it is the case. And the fourth element that's very important and that makes us interested in hybridization recently, since the APR law in 2023 and its decree in 2024, this law allowed us to create agrivoltaics, which allow us to create projects, PV parks, within farming lands. And why is that important? Is that it's because in France, more than 85% of wind turbines are put up on agricultural lands. So in 85% of them, where they work, they operate in function with agrivoltaism. And that's increased our interest in hybridization. We have a second question, Aline. Is ENGIE Green trying to evaluate the potential of hybridization? And to do so, how do you do it? So we're trying to evaluate its potential, of course. It's not easy because we've got to accumulate multiple elements. When we talk about hybridations, we're talking about agrivoltaics. So these farms are helping us to develop the agrivoltaics with technical and other contracts. We need to have a lot of good knowledge of all the technical items when it concerns wind turbines, what profiles they have, etc. And we've also got to have intense discussions with ENEDIS because there are regulations, and we've got a new context at ENEDIS. So the potential is being evaluated. Now I'm going to ask the same question to Etienne THOMASSIN from EDP Renewables. What is your definition of hybridization, and do you have any projects in France or in Europe? Yes. So hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm really pleased to participate in this roundtable. The definition of hybridization is a definition which is the same that Aline suggested, is to join together at the same location different technologies, wind turbine, solar, stocking them, maybe even hydraulics. And do we have this type of project? Yes. The reality is at EDP, we are really rooted in the Iberic Peninsula. So very early, we started on looking at subjects better optimizing how we would bring these elements together. In 2022, we began our first grid, joining together wind turbines and solar energy in Portugal. That was already existed, but we deployed these solar panels at the feet of the wind turbines. And today we have 300 megawatts of capacity currently operating, 100 megawatts in Spain in 3 different parks, 60 in Portugal, and 120 in Poland. Then we also looked to deploy the same way of operating here in France. It's not as easy. It's more complex. I'm sure we'll talk about it at the roundtable. There's a number of constraints. There are administrative, economic, or technical constraints. And despite all this, we have a few small projects that have really much advanced in their development. But we've got building contracts, building permits, and we'll be moving on with that. Thank you so much. If you can hear us in the technical room, my microphone doesn't work. So Gaël VALLÉE, same question at TotalEnergies. What's your definition of hybridization? And does TotalEnergies have any hybridization projects in France? Thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, we have the same definition. Often recently, when we're talking about hybridization, we were more thinking about ways of stocking, and it's from this aspect that we're looking at it to make it more dynamic. And today we agree about mixing wind turbine and solar energy. We've noticed the same things. We have the same challenges. Today our development in terms of projects is very meaningful throughout France and in and overseas territories, with constraints that are more and more difficult to overcome, but we're sure that we can optimize this without always building new networks and grids to optimize production and benefit from the growth of all these different types of energies. It's rather recent in the French areas. Our first projects are being developed with this operating style in mind. Our first example, clear example, which is rather particular, but a project carried out in the Réunion Island, and I'm going to speak about that in a little bit. Elodie Saya for the Union of Renewable Energies. Are there hybridized solar wind turbine installations in France? Are some of them being projected? Are they being developed? What is happening in France? So at this point, what we've seen at the Union of Renewable Energies, we represent the producers in France. So from the survey we carried out, because we've got subsidiaries we've got to talk about as well, today there is almost no hybrid grid, as we said earlier. So we don't have a full hybridized farm that's fully operational, up and running. However, there is one that was set up in 2023 that works within the complete and full cycle of hybridization and as terms of the technical and legal aspects. And this was a pioneer project which won an award. And what we see today, there's a real desire from the feedback from our producers, there's a real interest to combine technologies and create hybridized projects. We have projects that are at different stages of development. Some are more mature than others. We have projects that have all their authorizations, building permits, energy transitional, and they're almost on the just about to be built, and some will start in 2026, so that's just tomorrow. We've got other projects that are being created that are pretty far along and technical elements, and that now they're more in administrative meetings. And then we've got other developing projects that show that developers are interested in doing this. But today we don't have numbers, precise numbers or exhaustive numbers to share with you. But we can feel that there's a lot of interest, and this could be broadly accelerated if some of the limits were lessened, if we had lesser limits, because we've seen that there's a desire and a real interest. So the fact that there's none currently operating doesn't mean there's no interest in this technology, but they maybe need a little bit of a boost from the legal, regulatory aspects so that we can really take all the potential from this project. So, thank you. We certainly understand that it's a very recent, when we're talking about development of agrivoltaics, and we know that we don't have any precise numbers yet, but now we're going to move to the advantages of hybridization, why producers are suggesting to create hybridization. I'm going to start with Etienne THOMASSIN for EDP. So you're focused on hybridization for some time, certainly in other countries and now in France. What are the advantages for producers? The main advantage is economic, because at the end of the day, we're going to use a connection to the existing grid, which allows us to benefit from this network that's already in place. To give you an idea of scale, connecting to the existing grid, it's like 100,000 euros per kilometer. So you'd benefit from all of these connections already in place, would have a huge economic savings, obviously. Then, of course, we've got from the electric setup on the shared substation, and then we've got operating costs, even as they're marginal, and there are opportunities there. So it's kind of the glass half full situation, but you've got to keep in mind that half of the glass is empty because we're supported by the cables already in place. We can't put as much energy into it as we want, so we're often limited in size as compared to the new installation that needs to be put in place. And we'll talk about that after. So the advantages and inconveniences, we'll speak about that later, but I had another question for you, Mr. THOMASSIN. Is there a specific economic model for hybridization in France? No, there's no specific model. In any case, we didn't use a specific model, but in general, we do look at an existing solar park where we'll put in solar panels that are in proximity, or wind turbine parks. So the wind turbine parks is already selling electricity in PPA or complementary revenue. So the new grid, a PV grid that we're going to put in place, is separate. It's independent to give added value to this energy. Thank you. That's very clear. Aline from NG Green. The advantages are what for you, for producers, but also for local authorities and society? I agree what's been said. There's a real we need to benefit from all the investments in the existing grids. And it's this logic of optimization, as Gaël said. As I said, and as we said, we don't have the same resources. We have wind, but we have no sun, and when we have sun, we have no wind. So with one single cable, we can have solar production, and when we've got wind, we've got the wind turbine production. So it's really this logic of bringing all this together and optimizing it. For a local authority point of view, we think that this will agrivoltaic projects will emerge that could never exist without hybridization. Because in some agricultural areas, the connecting points are so far from each other, meaning the projects could not finance them. So when we create hybridization, we can have new agrivoltaic projects that wouldn't have been able to benefit from these projects. And we could almost say that projects can emerge that of a moderate size because we're saving on connecting to the grid. So these moderate-sized projects, and as concerns those two in terms of people accepting this, it could be interesting to have areas where we bring energy together. So one area has a dominant source of energy, and that makes sense. But if we go further, in some places, in terms of the landscape, it can be interesting to bring all these different energy parks together. Thank you, Gaël VALLÉE for Total Energy. Do you want to add to that in terms of the advantages? And also tell us which are the advantages for the hybrid network. From a point of view of the perception in a particular area, I agree with everything that's been said. The approach of developing projects is changing. It takes time. We need to allow the local authority and local inhabitants to accept the project. It doesn't always work, but our job is to try and do it well. And once we look at a particular site where everyone's accepted that we'll see industrial production in terms of renewable energy, then it's a lot easier to go and imagine it increasing and connecting production sources. So we're adapting in these areas that is allowing us to go further. So there's a real interest in trying to focus on certain sites of production. And for the grid, I think there's two approaches. Clearly, we have an approach from management of this grid that oversees a maximum theoretical production amount, and up to now we've not really tried to benefit from this expansion, where we use a lot, maybe go over the transit limits authorized, and we'll speak about that. And that's things that are sometimes allowed, but it's to optimize the entirety of the grid and the network, which has already been developed. I think the word patrimoine, heritage was used, but what it already exists, and we need to try to optimize it and continue to grow it. But sometimes that's a little bit slower than the need for the development of energy. And this effect is also researched. There's a balance for some of these energies. But there's an effect that allows this to the local network from the source grid. What's important is the manager, the overseer of this network, whether it's NADs or RTE, they're already carrying out projects to find technical solutions to increase production from what was originally, and we've got bearable constraints for producers. And I think that's the example that you spoke about. So now we're going to go to the first Q&A. Maybe you've got the QR code here on the screen. So there's already a few questions. You can like the questions, and that means the questions will be read first. One question is hybridization could be applicable for offshore wind turbines or floating PV parks. Who has offshore projects and would like to answer this question? I can say a few words. For the moment, I think it will be rather difficult. In theory, yes, but the reality is that we're not at the same level in terms of ability to produce. Offshore will concentrate hundreds of megawatts or even gigawatts with transport technologies that are different than those that we use on land. And floating PV parks aren't in that same dimension. These objects there's a lot of R&D, there's a first deployment, they're much smaller, so it's not currently a possibility. And I could add to that, I agree with him, but a floating solar park are on flat waters, lakes, or ponds. In the sea, we have other constraints and difficulties, so it's very difficult to set up a solar panel floating farm in the sea. Another question on the ratio of power of wind turbines and power of solar panels. Is there a ratio that you could speak to? When we're talking about hybridization, I could...
Ah oui, d'accord, tout à fait. Alors, autre question.
So there's another question.
Oui, une question sur la sécurité.
In terms of safety and security, when we're installing these solar panels under these wind turbines, are you planning on having safety areas around them? And how many meters do we need to be, how many distance do we need to be away from turbines, the risk of frost, the risk of other safety issues? I don't know if we developed these questions in France. Yes, we have an answer. Yeah. In reality, when we say we're putting in these PV farms at the foot of the wind turbine, it's more a way of speaking. It's not literally at the foot of the wind turbine. It can be 100 meters away or 200 meters away. So we do, there is quite a big gap, a distance. They're in the same geographical area, but not necessarily directly beneath.
Alors, je sais pas, après, là, il y a une question qui est...
There's a question, is it possible, technically and legally, for individuals to put solar panels on their roof and a wind turbine in their field, in their yard? We're talking about large-scale products here for wind turbines and PV parks. We're not necessarily specialized in small-scale wind turbines, so unfortunately we're not going to answer that. So there's a question, but we'll be answering it later. What's your experience in Spain? And we're going to speak about that in the third part of this. How do we go from PLUNOV to a PV? Does someone understand this question? Maybe we'll speak about that later. I think it's talking about urbanism. To create PV or agri-PV, we need an area, a picture to your site, because it's only authorized in the A areas. And if it's compatible PV, then we need a compatible area. But the two zones will be specific to each project. These questions really concern the third part. For example, how do we oversee some of the legal constraints? So they're different depending on the size of the farm. If we're talking about hybridized, what is the most important role for the ICP in terms of waste management, traceability, maintenance? Who wants to answer this question on some of the legal constraints on these farms? These remain individual projects that they have impact studies, individual impact studies that allow an authorization to a building authorization, but the proximity, so that we'll try to optimize solutions for connecting to the grid. With the same delivery substation or the same cable, which will be linked to the source a few kilometers or a dozen kilometers away, but we're really looking at legalese that's all separated. There's no hybridization in terms of the authorizations that will be agreed upon. So you have a lot of questions. That's great, because we're going to head into the third part concerning the legal constraints and technical constraints and the solutions that these producers have to offer us, and as well as the network.
We'll begin with Etienne Thomassin for EDP. Can you remind us of the regulatory framework in France and why it limits hybridization? Well, it's quite simple because hybridization as such is not defined in the French regulations so far. Therefore, it's practically inexistent. There is one regulatory constraint that exists around... If you want to connect to the distribution grid, there is an article that dates back to the 9th of June 2020, which says that you cannot set up more than 17 megawatts if you're in metropolitan France, or 12 megawatts if you're not connected to the metropolitan grid. So there's this notion of installed capacity, which quite simply corresponds to the sum of the capacities of the different technologies that are connected. So if we take a simple example, you have a 15-megawatt farm. You can only add 2 megawatts of PV panels, so that you don't exceed the limit of 17 megawatts indeed. So that is the regulatory constraint. I think that there are also technical constraints related to the cable capacity. Lynn Chapiot for Energy Green, can you explain this to us? Because you develop projects beneath this ceiling of 17 megawatts. So I suggested that I would show you a diagram, if we can have it on the screen. And this makes it simple. This is just as an indication, but it is a real example. We take 3 turbines, 3 machines, 9 megawatts, 3 times 3, classical standard case. These 3 machines are there. They're connected to a delivery substation of our company, Energy Green. And then there is a cable that goes from the substation to the Enedis source substation. And the size of the cables, they're often ratios, but here there is a 10-megawatt cable that was installed. So the wind production is fed into the grid. So there are 2 ceilings that are constraints today. As Etienne said, the regulatory ceiling in the delivery substation, that's a regulatory ceiling. We cannot put more than 17 megawatts in this substation. Then there's a second technical ceiling, that of the cable. The cable was sized for 10 megawatts. We can put 1, 2, 3, 4 up until 10, but not 11. It's physical. So we have 2 technical ceilings. When we see this, we want to add PV panels, and the mistake we mustn't make is, well, there's 1 mega left in the cable. We can install 1 mega of PV and send it through the cable. But no, hybridization would be to install 8 megawatts of PVs, because 9 and 8 make 17, so we fit within the regulatory ceiling. The 10 mega cable is still there. And as I said, when there's wind, there's no sun. So when there's wind, the 9 megas from the wind turbines go through the cable. When it's sun, the 8 megas go through the same cable. And sometimes there is an overlap and double resource, double production. In that case, we can exceed the 10 megawatts, and the cable would not be able to cope with it. So in this case, It's the principle of dynamic hybridization. We will lower the sun production, and the second is the objective contract. So we don't touch the wind turbine. So it's the PV panels that are that we know how to cut it off when we need to. How do you do it? Well, technically, I can't tell you, but we are able to stop the production at the right time. So you lose production. Yes, that's what we call the flattening out. It's the production that we don't see in the network, in the grid. Yes, it's really case by case. So, for example, if you go from the north of France, and the overlap of sun and wind is quite rare, so we won't need to stop the sun production or flatten it off. So when we go to the south, there is more often wind and sun. Therefore, we will have to flatten we will have to clip the production of the sun. So we can understand that hybridization is more effective in the north than in the south, which is not fair because in the south we will have to clip things more, but there is more dual production. So it's case by case. It's a very geographical approach. Can you clip it up to 10%? Yes. And is it interesting from a financial point of view? Because when you cut off the sun PV production, you're not producing energy, and this PV farm costs money. Well, it's a question of balancing things out, because if the loss of production, electrical production, therefore the loss of turnover, is lower than the gain that we won by mutualizing everything, then there is a problem. But so that comes back to your initial question: how do you assess the potential? Well, it is farm by farm, machine by machine, quite simply. Well, everything's clear. I will pass the floor to Gaël. We're going to move on to an example. It's not commissioned yet, but it will be soon. TotalEnergies has developed a hybrid project in the Reunion Island. So it is within under the Commission of Regulation of Energy. It is a system that allows us to test innovation on the grid thanks to derogations from the authorities. What are the grid constraints of this project? So first of all, you can explain the project and the constraints it met and the solutions that TotalEnergies found. So yes, we have 2 slides to explain the project. We won't go into the detail, but this is a place where we have a wind farm and several PV farms next to each other. So it's the same site, as we can see. Technically speaking, the wind farm is split into 2 because it exceeds the power not of 17 megawatts, but of 12 megawatts, which is the maximum regulatory that we can have in overseas territories. And so it's separated into 2 parts. So we have a first wind farm that we can see in the photo, and 2 additional farms that will connect nearby. So if we go to the following slide, mostly it's the same principle that we've just heard. We have a little bit of residual capacity in the cable. And these are projects that are each taken separately with their own source substation, their purchase contract, and obligation for separate connection. We have a wind farm of 11 megas and a capacity of evacuation of 12 megas. There is 1 mega left, and we want to connect one of the 2 PV projects, so the one that is 3.6 megawatts, to this residual 1 megawatt. This meant that we had to ask for a regulatory derogation because, firstly, we were exceeding the threshold of 12 megawatts, which was the equivalent of the 17 megawatt threshold in France, metropolitan France. But also, you cannot mutualize upstream of this source substation. So it's an alternative connection option But it does not allow us to go below 70% of the declared power of the installation. So we want to connect 27% of the production. So we did our sums and simulations, and it works very well. So once again, there's a multiplication. There will be a loss of about 7 to 8%, which is quite acceptable in the project's economic model. If we weren't able to do this, and I come back to this empty sand pit, when it was launched, we applied to have the right to test these administrative derogations, and the projects will be commissioned next year. If we had not been able to do this, the farm of only 3.6 megawatts would have had to find its own autonomous connection solution. And it was 10 kilometers to the source substation, and we would never have been able to run this project. So we're really carrying out the first trials to find technological solutions, which even the grid manager is looking for. But by default, due to the administration, it's not possible. Isn't there a constraint linked to this clipping? I think Enedis grants you a 5% clipping maximum, and you need to clip at 7%. Well, yes, I didn't go into that level of detail, but there was a dual constraint. We couldn't go below 70% of the installed power, and we could not clip more than 5%. And we sought a dual derogation to go below 70% and to clip a little bit more than 5%. And in this case, it's between 7 and 8, which remains very low and acceptable. Thank you very much for this example. I think that we can carry on. And I had another question about batteries. Because is this included in this project of hybridization or not? Yes, the wind farm already operates with batteries because that was the tariffication condition of the project. It was wind turbines with a specific fee with a production that was valorized at peak hours in the evening. And in the second example, the clipping is a little bit lower, around 10%. And here it was of interest to add an additional battery container to reduce the clipping below 8%. And it was of interest to do this. So in one of the two solutions of connection, we added one battery to the PV farm to contain the clipping. And it works very well. Thank you very well. That's very clear. Thank you very much. And Odile Saya for the SAR. So question on this famous regulatory ceiling of 17 megawatts in metropolitan France and in 12 megawatts in non-interconnected zones. But what does the SAR think about this threshold of 17 megawatts? And do you have any solutions? Yes, with regard to the ceiling of 17 megawatts, today this is a ceiling that is present in a law of the 9th of June 2021, so it's regulatory, and it is the main constraints of projects today, which means that a lot of problems come up against this and have troubles. And this gives rise to a segmentation of projects, which does not allow us to pool costs and constraints related to substations. So the reference in the law is the installed power, whereas initially the 17 megawatt ceiling were established with regard to the capacity of feed. So then there's a nonsense in the regulation. We don't know why we should keep these 7 megawatts focused on installed power, whereas the constraint is with regard to the feed-in. So we suggest something quite simple. It is to switch to the feed-in power and not the installed power, because once we blocked the installed power, we don't propose a ceiling, but something like 30 or 35. But we can keep this 17 for the feed-in and then go beyond for installed capacity, which will allow us to develop potential and to remove this regulatory constraint, which is disputable from a technical point of view. So our position is quite basic. And I talked with the authorities. They are not against the fact of switching this regulatory constraint, but with regard to the grid operator, Enedis, we don't know what they will decide. They proposed to stick with the 17-megawatt constraint, but allow us to add installed capacity in addition to the 17, so we would have 17 plus X. This is something they're looking at. And from the point of view of the governmental regulatory authorities, what they want to do is to work with an example from this sandpit pilot and vote modification in the decree. So we support the experimentation in this sandpit, but it might seem ill-adapted from a time point of view because it's a derogation over 4 years that we can only have once. So with regard to a project and funding, it is not suitable because there are projects that last more than 8 years for the derogation, and this is also which can block projects. We have the winners that were in the sandpit, but which couldn't see the light of day due to this time constraint. So the law would be beneficial for all because there was a question of PV and storage, and the constraint is present there also. This solution would be quite simple and would allow us to replicate it at a large scale. So storing plus PV, you can't exceed 17 megawatts. Yes, so we can change, the law for both hybridizations. So this answers one of the questions, which is very good. Etienne, Thomas.
Ça se passe en Espagne et au Portugal, puisque vous nous avez expliqué que.
So you explained that the DP.
Est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire plus?
Oui, donc ce que je disais en introduction.
So what we're saying in the introduction is that the constraint for connection is felt far more upstream, including in regulations. So far more upstream was defined. It dates back to 2019 in Portugal, 2020 in Spain. There are 2 decrees and one circulation which defines what we can do or not. So the first point is the connection contract. In this contract, you can ask for an updating of your contract if you respect the conditions. The first condition is with regard to the feed-in power. We can increase the power by 5%. An example, a 5-megawatt farm, we can inject up to 52.5 megawatts. The second condition is on installed power, and the installed power of the first farm must represent at least 40% of the power of the hybrid system. So you can add up to 75 megawatts in installed capacity. And the third condition is that both production areas should be at less than 10 kilometers from each other. So you can ask for an update of your connection contract, and you can benefit from an accelerated process, means that you jump the queue.
Ça, c'est pour le contrat de raccordement. Ensuite, pour ce qui est du permis, là, il n'y a pas de...
With regard to permits, you can create hybridized production facilities, but for the valorization of energy, there is no specific procedure. Therefore, you can recuperate the value of your energy as you would do with an isolated production unit, but you need to put a meter to identify what share of the energy comes from each of the production units. Thank you. I think that Elodie Saya, you also have something to say about Spain. Does this example inspire you? Do you want to add to this? Yes, just to say that we are very interested by the regulatory framework in Spain, and we are drawing inspiration from this for our work and the proposals we are making to the administration. So first of all, the Spanish framework has the merit of clearly defining what hybridized projects are and to give them their own existence. In France, we don't describe what a hybrid product is, well, the specificities, but in Spain there are a whole list of projects and different typologies, and the fact of creating its legal existence is essential. There are also rules that are favorable to the project, so priority access to add new modules. This is very interesting also. And the advantage of the Spanish case also is that there is no arbitrary ceiling, such as the 17 megawatts in France. And what is decisive is that we can determine which authority instructs the permits and the authorizations. And the other advantage of the Spanish framework is in terms of the economic framework with regard to the financial advantages of developing hybrid projects and adding new modules to existing production units, because in the framework of financial guarantees for standard products, we have a guarantee of 40 euros per kilowatt. So when we add a module, the guarantee goes down by half. So it's also an incentive financially to develop projects. So yes, I imagine that France is drawing inspiration from them. So from the point of French point of view, with regard to the obstacle of 17 megawatts, there is no specific calls for projects for hybrid projects. And so one of the ideas that we have, and which is part of the proposals, is to really put the spotlight on these projects in the scope of calls for projects, or kind of raise their value in these calls for tenders. Then there is another difficulty in the hybrid projects. It's a bit technical, but it's the interpretation that Enedis, the grid operator, is done with regard to indirect connection to allow a producer to add modules to an identical substation dedicated to a wind farm. So in brief, there is a notion of connection of the installations and land unity, which means that these farms must be very close. And this interpretation is restrictive, and therefore it prevented the indirect connection between installations. And the jurisprudence was changed by the Court 10 because it decided that this restriction was illegal. And we could have a blockage on with regard to this technical point. So this is also an important point, the compliance of Enedis with law. What is the CORDIS? The CORDIS is the authority that arbitrates between the different producers and Enedis, which is the grid operator in France. So how can we unlock, these are the solutions to unlock hybridization in France. So now we move on to your questions.
Il y en a plusieurs. Alors, je me demande si on n'a pas répondu à celle-ci. Justement, est-ce que le parc photovoltaïque sous bridage dynamique peut candidater à l'appel d'offres de la Creux?
So, we have a question about the call for tender. The call tenders do not give an advantage to hybridization. So the answer is yes, we're working on this.
Des questions sur le parc, l'exemple de TOTALENERGIES à La Réunion.
So there's the example of Total Energy in the Reunion. How did the regulatory sandpit process take to have feedback on your project? Well, it took quite a long time. So quite quickly, we knew that we had won the right to go and attempt this experimentation. This was validated by the CRE. Then there were discussions with the DGCE to officialize the right to have a derogation in the request for connection made to EDF, and that took longer. To be quite honest, the authorizations and the permit to be obtained by the project also took longer than planned. So, all 3 years later, we are only now able to really set up these projects and to properly test our modeling and the derogations that we requested. There was one question that was like twice. Are the accumulated impacts of both projects assessed? So the answer is yes, because generally the projects have different time spans, and it must take into account all of the projects that have a published environmental authorization. Do you confirm? Yes, absolutely. We must take into account what already exists. Now we have some quite technical questions here. Can we benefit from the impact survey of the wind project for the PV project? I think it's quite similar to the previous question. If so, do we gain time on the instruction of our case? The answer is it depends. The impact survey studies a certain scope, so we must make sure that the scope between both production units overlaps. The second condition is that it has a validation duration, so the impact survey should not be too old with regard to the second subject. If the studies are too dated, we must redo the survey. So the shade cast by the revolving wind turbines can affect the PV panel production because there are electrical oscillations. Two people asked the same question. Yes, we do study this because when we model what can be produced and the potential dynamic production of the sun farm, we model all of this, but quite honestly, it's no different from clouds going over the PV farm. And when we look at the curve of production, it's not just a nice, smooth curve, but there are peaks and dips. So the wind turbines does not interfere more than that. For hybrid projects with possible different development and operation products, how do we manage and prioritize the management of the wind farm with regard to the PV farm with different productions? This is in the case where there are different development partners for hybrid projects. How do we prioritize the operation of the wind or the sun farms? Well, the question is not for the operator, but the owner. It's the project. It's not the person that operates and does the maintenance. In the examples that we've seen and the examples that will be built, the wind farm was there already before the PV farm. So if the wind farm exists, it's because there is a contract with a duration. So it takes precedence. So when the owner is the same, but what about when there are two different owners? Will it be the same thing? In Green, we look at hybridization on our production units. Is it possible to have two different owners? One for the wind farm and the other for the sun farm?
Vous le faites pas.
Not in NG, but what about DP? You don't do it either? Same owner? Okay, well, there you go. You have your answer.
En théorie, c'est possible.
But potentially it would be possible, Elodie, to have two different owners.
OK.
Right.
Alors. Ah bah d'ailleurs, c'était une des questions.
Well, that was one of the questions. So we've answered that.
Sont-ils exploités par le même porteur de projet ou des partenariats sont déjà mis en place?
That was the same question.
Doit-on être exploitant du parc éolien pour pouvoir développer le parc?
Must we be operator? Well, that's the same question.
Une autre question sur
Another question about Total project.
je crois que vous l'avez dit pendant
I think that you said this, but
a-t-elle une durée limitée?
is your derogation limited in time? Yes. 4 years, it can be renewed once, so it's 8 years of derogation, after which either the CRE and the public authorities consider that it is a derogation that makes sense and that they have the intention of mainstreaming, in which case we can stay in the configuration developed, which is approved by the grid manager, etc., or they consider that it is not sufficiently reliable or not interesting, and that it remains an object that is feasible once in one place, but it can't be mainstreamed. That's the idea of the empty sandpit. Can the projects be mainstreamed?
Le grand enjeu. Quid de la quote-part?
What about the S3R and renewable energies share? In the example of the sandpit, we pay for our share. There is a connection of a given power to the grid, but we accepted to enter a system where we have accepted to clip this production. That's our choice as a producer. We think it's good for the project and it allows us to achieve the project, but we pay for the share. Is the drop in public aid and the rise in prices encourage hybrid farms?
La baisse des aides publiques, là,
And the drop in subsidies.
question, comment vérifier la puissance?
Another question, how can we check how much power can be connected to the existing structure without contacting the grid operator?
La réponse est dans la question.
The answer is in the question.
On connaît au moment où on a installé le parc solaire.
When we set up the PV farm, we know what power of the cable is, but things can happen, and that is Enedis, the grid operator. So even though they're our machines and our wind turbines, which have been there for a few years, we will always ask the grid operator for confirmation. So the exact feed-in volumes and the validation of the technical proposal is EDFC, the grid operator of the Reunion, that validated it with their own studies. The load factor on the 10 megawatt cable with the given ratios, maybe you're talking about the total example. Yes, I don't know what the load factor is, but what I can say is that it is greater, but it was approved by EDF-SRE. Thank you very much. I can see that there are still a number of questions, but it is 1 minute past 3, and we're going to expect the time. Thank you to our 4 speakers, Aline Chapillot, Etienne Thomassin, Eddie Sayer, Gaël VALLÉE. Thank you for listening to us. I hope that you've learned a lot, and we'll be back for the next roundtable.